classical conditioning. So that's when you take advantage of biological and instinctual responses to create create association between unrelated stimuli. So classical conditioning, you take something that is biological, something that you were born with, and you use that to create a specific behavior that you're looking for. So, first, an unconditioned stimuli. So that's when it's a certain stimuli that causes an innate or reflexive psychological response. Otherwise, it's known as the unconditioned response. So, an unconditioned stimuli would be like smelling something good, like a food, and salivating. So it's an unconditioned stimuli because it's a biological response. You can't stop yourself. Once you smell good food, you'll start salivating, and the salivating part is the unconditional response. So it's not something that you learn, it's just something that you're born with. You didn't have to learn it or condition yourself to do it. And then neutral stimuli would be something that doesn't create any response at all. So it doesn't cause an unconditioned response. So it would be like if I waved a piece of paper in front of you, you wouldn't start salivating because of the piece of paper. It's neutral. It wouldn't really cause a response. But it can be a signaling stimuli. So that's when a neutral stimuli has the potential to become a conditioned stimuli. So it's something that normally wouldn't cause a specific behavior response, but because of classical conditioning, you can use it to create a conditioned stimuli. So conditioned stimuli is a neutral stimuli that causes a reflexive or physiological response after association, and that leads to a conditioned response to it. So the conditioned response is the learned behavior response after classical conditioning to turn that neutral stimuli that would normally cause no reaction or behavior to cause the conditioned response. Sorry, I said stimuli a lot of times. Does everyone understand how like each of these different stimuli are different from each other? Okay. If anyone has questions, just put it in the chat. Mark can help you, or just let me know later. So classical conditioning, we want to start with acquisition. So that's when you take advantage of the reflexive or not unconditioned stimulus to turn it. So you take advantage of the reflexive unconditioned stimulus to turn a neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. So that's when you take a neutral stimulus that would normally cause no reaction, but when you pair it to a unconditioned stimulus, you can turn it into a conditioned stimulus. But so as I went over earlier in the lecture, so extinction is related to like habituation, where the conditioned stimulus has no response after a while. So normally the conditioned stimulus that was learned would cause a response, but after being exposed to the conditioned stimulus, after being exposed to the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus, no response would occur. But something called spontaneous recovery can occur when the extinct conditioned stimulus, so the conditioned stimulus that was habituated and caused no response, it can cause a weak conditioned response after a period of time. So it's like when you this like response that you learned after you leave it for a while, and then you re-expose them to the conditioned stimulus, it would lead to a weak conditioned response, even after extinction and habituation. And then a phenomenon known as generalization is when a stimulus similar to the conditioned response can produce a something similar to the conditioned stimulus can produce a conditioned response. So it's like when you're exposed to something similar. So if I were to ring a bell, imagine like a bell was the conditioned stimulus, something similar to the bell, like a triangle or another instrument that plays a sound similar to a bell. It's when that similar stimulus also creates a response creates the conditioned response. So it's a broadening effect. It's when something similar to the conditioned stimulus causes the conditioned response. And the opposite is discrimination. So when you learn to distinguish between two similar stimuli. So that would be when you ring a bell and you are able to distinguish two different types of bells. So only one specific type of bell would be able to cause the conditioned response. So that's the opposite. It's not a broadening effect. It's more of like a narrowing effect where only a specific stimulus would cause the conditioned response. Okay. So the classic example of classical conditioning is Pavlov's dog. So Pavlov, he experimented with dogs. So he noticed that if you place food in front of a dog, it would start salivating like we do too. So the food would be the unconditioned stimulus because the dog didn't have to learn to salivate when he sees food. And so when you presented the unconditioned stimulus to the dog, there would be a response, which is salivation. And that salivation response is the unconditioned response because the dog didn't have to be taught to salivate when it saw food. So this is before any conditioning happened. So we have the unconditioned stimulus that naturally and biologically causes the unconditioned response. So in his experiment, he noticed that neutral stimulus, which is the bell, caused no response. So no salivation occurred, which is something that you expect because normally a dog would not start salivating when you bring a bell in front of it. So the neutral stimulus caused no conditioned response. But during his experiment, when he was doing the conditioning, he presented the food to the dog, but whenever he presented food to the dog, he also rung a bell. So when he gave the food to the dog, he also rang the bell. And so these two were paired with each other. So the unconditioned stimulus, which was the food, was paired with the neutral stimulus, which was the bell. So because the food was presented to the dog, there was a response, which was salivation. So the food paired with the bell caused the unconditioned response of salivation because the dog was presented with the food. But after a while, after repeatedly presenting the food and the bell to the dog, he noticed that even if he didn't present food to the dog, if he just rang the bell, the dog started salivating. So now the bell has become the unconditioned. No, sorry. The bell has become a conditioned stimulus. So after conditioning, a bell, which would normally be a neutral stimulus because it causes no effect to the dog, has become a conditioned stimulus because the dog starts salivating whenever he or she heard the bell being rung. So that would mean the bell can now cause a conditioned response of salivation. So the dog has learned to pair the bell with food. So whenever the dog heard the bell, he automatically thought that he was getting food because during conditioning, he was presented with food and a bell at the same time. So after conditioning, the bell, which is the conditioned stimulus, causes a response of salivation, which is the conditioned response because of the conditioning that the dog received when being paired with food and the bell when it was being fed.